I'm Dr. Tony Pollard, and I am the Director of the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at the University of Glasgow in Scotland.
What is battlefield archaeology, Tony?
It's a branch of archaeology which specialises in human conflict, and some people prefer the term conflict archaeology, but I believe there is a battlefield archaeology for the very reason that it specialises in battlefields. It's looking at battles themselves, as opposed to the wider world of conflict, which can take many forms. And the challenge in battlefield archaeology is that many battles take place over hours, minutes even, whereas traditional archaeology, we're looking at sites which may have been occupied for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. So the challenge to us as battlefield archaeologists is to try and tell a story through an event, or tell a story of an event which lasted a very short span of time. And to my mind, that's one of the challenges which I find really attractive, because it is a challenge. And here at Lützen, we've got the opportunity to work on a very big battlefield, on a very big scale. And the level of metal detecting survey which has been done here is much more intensive and widespread than we would normally have the opportunity to do in the UK. So my colleagues and myself are very pleased to be involved in this project, to see something so big happening. I think we would dearly love to see similar projects happening in the UK more often, but the field is still fairly young and we're still developing. But it's a very specific type of archaeology, but what it does, it speaks to a very general human experience. And the sad truth is that human nature has a dark side to it. And for as long now as we look back in time, even back to the prehistoric period, it appears that there has been warfare and conflict and violence of some sort. So it's a side of human nature which archaeologists for too long have ignored. And I'm glad to say that now we are facing up to that dark side of our past.
As you said, battlefield archaeology is a new field of archaeology. What is the development of battlefield archaeology? How did it begin?
Its origins are relatively recent, over the last 30 years, really. In America, people like Doug Scott and Fox had the opportunity at the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, where General Custer was killed in battling the Plains Indians. And there was a fire there which cleared away the vegetation from the battlefield site and exposed the ground surface. And I think for the first time they realized there were artifacts lying around left from the battle from 1876. And so they put in place an archaeological survey. And what that survey did, I think it surprised everyone. It really countered some of the traditional accounts, the historical accounts of the battle, and it didn't play out the way that the movies and the paintings have us believe. The archaeology, almost a forensic style of archaeology, told a different story, and I think got closer to the reality of what actually happened. I think we need to. There is a danger at times that we dismiss the history, but it provides a framework which allows us to tease out and to test both the archaeological record and the historical accounts. And I think now I do as much history as I do archaeology, and would hate to approach history from purely the written sources now. I think we've proved the fact that our approach, or the developing approach to battlefields and other sites of conflict, can really add an extra dimension to the story, which so often gets twisted or distorted in some way, because there's the old axiom that history is written by the victors, and what we can do is provide voice to those mute histories.
So battlefield archaeology brought us a new aspect, even in historical battles where we had a lot of sources.
Exactly. Well, one of the sites that I've been very involved with is the Battle of Culloden in Scotland from 1870. Rewind. The Battle of Culloden in Scotland, and it's famously the last battle fought on British soil, fought in 1746 between the Jacobites and the Hanoverians. And we have a lot of written accounts from that battle. It comes at a time when literacy is improving and military bureaucracy. So we have letters from combatants, we have maps drawn at the time, we have official accounts. But the thing is that all of those have a particular perspective And it was the Duke of Wellington that said, you might as well write the history of a ball as a battle or something like that. And what he meant was that a soldier on the battlefield cannot possibly know what's happening even 2 or 3 men away from him because he's so focused on what he's doing. And what the archaeology did was allow us to take all of those accounts together and work out exactly what did make sense as far as the archaeology was concerned and what was inaccurate. And we added a serious new dimension to our understanding of that battle. So the fact that we have accounts, people might think, well, we've got all these accounts of this battle, why do we need the archaeology? Well, the point is that those accounts are inherently flawed and always will be. And it's not just battles from 200-300 years ago. If we go back to the modern era, World War I, World War II, we will find the same biases in the historical record.
How worked battlefield archaeology practically? What are you doing at the battlefield archaeology?
Like all archaeological practice, we borrow techniques from various sources, and we use a lot of traditional archaeological techniques of field survey, topographic survey, but all of that it comes after the documentary source. We start out in the library, at the desk, looking at these historical accounts. If we have maps of the battle, all of this is information which is vital to us if we're looking at a historic period battle, and we go into the field armed with this material. And the first thing we try and do is work out where that battle actually took place. So we take those contemporary accounts and try and look at the modern landscape as it exists today, because nothing stays the same, and try and work out where the features on these drawn on the maps or alluded to in the written accounts, where they exist within the modern landscape. And doing that sort of historical reconstruction is really providing the foundation for the rest of the work. And quite uniquely, the archaeology of a battle is in the top maybe 30 to 50 centimeters of the ground. In traditional archaeology, that is the sort of stuff that we call it the topsoil or the plough soil. That's the sort of stuff we would just scrape away because we would be interested in the deeper archaeology, in the subsoil. But the battle, where we're looking at objects, bullets, arrowheads, buttons dropped from clothing, a lot of it metal, that's where this material is going to exist. So it has necessitated new methodologies. And I suppose the most obviously important of those is the use of the metal detector. And we use it in a very controlled way. Archaeologists have always have been suspicious of the metal detector because it can so easily be misused by people looking for treasure or whatever, not recording what they're doing. But what we as battlefield archaeologists have done is introduce a rigor to the use of that tool. It's a very, very useful tool, and it allows us to very precisely relocate these objects in the ground. And if we record them, and again, this is another important aspect of what we do, is recording with as pinpoint accuracy as we can get with whatever technology is. And the technology for doing that is advancing very, very quickly. So we now have satellite positioning and total station laser recording instruments. And if we build up from those tiny little pieces, the hundreds and thousands, at Lützen now, and I think there are between 5,000 and 7,000 objects related to the battle. And once you start to put all of those on a map, the theory is you can look at the debris scatter and make some sense of what that actually means. So you can start to build a history of the battle or a choreography of the battle, which, as I've said, may have only taken 2 or 3 hours. In some cases, battles last for about 20 minutes. So it has required us to take, in some cases, quite old technologies, such as the metal detector. It's been around in popular use since really the Second World War. It was developed initially from mine detection. We've taken these technologies and we've put them to a new use and integrated them. And I think that's the point, is what we do as archaeologists, and it's not just battlefield archaeologists, is we use these technologies as they become available, but integrate them across a broad spectrum so that we're getting as much as we possibly can, as much information as we can from the data we're recovering.
What about the popular interest of battlefield archaeology in England?
In the UK, there is a huge amount of interest in battlefield archaeology. And it's benefited us greatly. We've been very successful in popularizing it through television, through newspapers, whatever medium is available. And again, it's almost like a different tool in our box. And it's allowed us to get across to the general public that these sites are important. But it's very fortunate that people have almost an innate interest in these darker parts of their history. And people can go to standing stones or cathedrals, but that people seem to get really very excited when they're looking at a site where they know that hundreds of people or thousands of people met their death. And it's a kind of, there's this new field of study called dark tourism, where people go to sites where nasty things have happened because they have this fascination for them. And in a way, battlefield archaeology is a part of that. But I think people just have this fascination for what happened in their history, which might not necessarily be pleasant, but it's a side of our life as human beings that we have to face up to, and especially in the modern world where conflict is all around us and we are bombarded daily with newspaper stories and television pictures of conflicts around the world. But I think people are using the past now almost to come to terms with what's happening in the present, because we can see the origins of many of these conflicts going back centuries. So I think it's benefited us greatly that people do have this interest. And I think the onus or the responsibility that we have is to make sure that we present these stories in as professional a way as possible, because it is possible to get overawed by this material and misuse it. And I think we have a very deep responsibility to make sure that we are objective and we tell the stories as we believe they actually occurred, rather than guessing too much. And the good thing about archaeology is that if we present the data in a professional scientific manner, then it is capable of reinterpretation later. And people can look at it and go, well, they actually got that bit wrong. But that's all part of the scientific process.
Do you think that we should protect battlefields, and which battlefields should be protected?
Yes, the subject of battlefield protection is a contentious one. And I have very recently, and still am, involved with Historic Scotland in my home country. And that Historic Scotland are the people that basically look after the heritage of the nation. And over the last 6 or so years, they have taken a real interest in battlefield sites. And I myself and my colleagues at the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at Glasgow University have been very much involved in looking at Scotland's battlefields. And we have some very famous sites like Culloden, like Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce fought. And we've been trying to work out what sites are of historical importance and how we should start to protect them. Because the problem with battlefields is they are very problematic. They are not like a prehistoric monument or a castle where you can see it in the landscape, you can draw a line around it and say, there's the castle, that's outside of the castle. With a battlefield, it leaves a very little physical evidence of itself for the casual viewer to see. We've got all of these perhaps objects buried in the ground, but until you survey it, they're invisible. So what you have is a landscape, and it's very difficult for people to understand, I suppose, in some cases, that this is an archaeological site. But the thing is, it covers a huge area, and life goes on. We can't preserve the landscape in aspect. We're fools to ourselves if we think that. But I think now we have to take responsibility for these sites, because to fully understand what happened in these locations, I firmly believe that the best way to do that is to take people to these sites and say, there is the hill that army stood on, there's the hill that army stood on, and we know from the metal detector survey that the two armies met here, and that side was forced back there, and these men are buried here. And all of these little pieces of the jigsaw all go together, but the board that jigsaw is made up on is the landscape. So we need to think very carefully about how we're going to stop buildings or factories or roads, but it has to be done in an intelligent fashion. And I think we're only just beginning to think seriously about this. We're not there yet at all. For instance, in Scotland, we have a register of 30-odd sites, which we regard as very important, but they're still not protected by law. There is still no law which will say you will not build within the boundary of what has been defined as this battlefield. What the inventory is designed to do is to draw people's attention to it. So if there is a plan to build a factory, the planning archaeologist or the council can go, we know this is in a battlefield area, we need to think very carefully, can it be relocated? We certainly have to do archaeological survey. So it's in its youth, but it's very, very important that we start to think carefully about how we are going to preserve these battlefields, because future generations need to know what happened at these sites. And there is a philosophical importance to what we do, in that if we forget what happens in the past, it's very easy to let it happen again. And this is where looking at the darker side of our past is fundamentally important to our development as a modern society.
Tony, you are leading the only Battlefield Institute in Glasgow. What projects are going on there, and what are the results?
The Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at Glasgow University has a number of missions. We have students. We run the first and really the only master's programme in battlefield and conflict archaeology. We also have now a growing number of students. Indeed, one of them is now Andre with the Lutzen project. So we have the educational side of what we do. We do a lot of community projects on battlefields, because we believe that if these sites are going to be protected, they're going to be protected in a way by the people that live near them and on them, and people have to feel an ownership to these sites. So we work with a lot of communities actually on the sites, and we've got a new project coming up from the Battle of Philip Hoare, from what used to be called the English Civil War, but is now better known as the War of the Three Kingdoms, because Scotland played a really important part. So we've got a project just starting there. We've got this long-term project at Culloden, which has now been going on and off with the National Trust for Scotland for 10 years or so. And I would dearly love to get back and look at that. And we're now going into a new stage of our development. The Centre for Battlefield Archaeology has now been going for about 6 years. And I think we're now looking at the future, because the subject has matured and we have matured. And there are a number of sites and projects that we would like to work on. And I think the important thing here is that, and Lutzen's a very good example, I think we're now moving away from working as individuals on our own pet projects to collaborating as groups, to look at a series of sites on a more global scale and looking at what lessons they have to teach us.
You talk about Culloden. There's a visitor center in Culloden. Is this successful? Has it visitors?
Yeah, well, the visitor centre came at a really important time, because we did some work on the battlefield there in about 2000, when we were making the BBC series 2 Men in a Trench, and it was the first battlefield archaeology that had been done in Scotland, and it was a huge relief to discover that there was archaeology there. Especially when we had a TV camera pointing at us, and when our survey started to pull out musket balls and such like. And it became very apparent in that short space of time that we had a contribution to make to telling the story of Culloden, which might have been quite different to some of the historical accounts, as we've discussed. So the National Trust for Scotland at the time were interested in upgrading their visitor centre, and the archaeology and that aspiration combined. And what we did was work in very close cooperation with the National Trust for Scotland, and provided a reinterpretation of the battlefield. We discovered very quickly that the signposts and the footpaths in some cases were totally in the wrong place. The archaeology told us that was a very fundamental thing that archaeology allows you to do, is to find your battlefield. And it was quite apparent that there were mistakes had been made, so they were all changed. And we also provided new information for this new visitor centre. So the artefacts that we found, and I think this is very important, are still on the site. You can now walk through the visitor centre and see the musket balls and the other objects that we have located on the battlefield, and we know within centimetres where they came from. And we've been able to really look at those moments of combat, and some of the most ferocious fighting you can imagine took place in the afternoon of the 16th of April 1746, and we've pinpointed that site and almost peeled back the layers and captured those moments. And now that the visitor can go through the visitor centre, and then importantly go out onto the battlefield and be confident that when they see a notice which says this is where this event happened, they can be confident that it did, because the archaeology has proved that point. And I'm really proud of that centre, because it's the first time, I think, in the world that a battlefield has been interpreted for the general public as much through the archaeology as it has through the history. And certainly places like Little Bighorn are moving in that way. But I think the opening of the Culloden Centre in 2008 now has really set the bar quite high. And it's now, I think, quite rightly, an international flagship for how battlefields can be presented to the public.
What do you think about the future of the battlefield archaeology?
I think it has a very interesting future, and I've now been involved in it for about a decade, and I've seen it develop very, very rapidly within that period. I think we're almost now at a time where we have to take stock and look at what is working and what isn't working. And I think the conference that's just about to happen in Osnabrück is going to be very important there. And again, meeting up with our colleagues in Lützen on a fairly regular basis provides us with a good opportunity to share ideas and talk about our own projects. So I think we need to assess what we're doing, work out what is working, what's not working. But I also think that there are new fields that we can move into, and I'm particularly interested in looking at very modern periods of conflict. I'm hoping that one of my long-term ambitions to look at the 1982 war in the Falkland Islands between the British Army and the Argentinian Army may soon come to fruition, because I believe, as we talked about the accounts from 1746 from Culloden, the archaeology working together to tell a fuller story. If you read the accounts of the Falklands War, you get disagreements and different perspectives. And I think the archaeology there can work to tying that together and telling a fuller story. And I think as conflict continues right up to the present day, and will do so unfortunately, I think we will find ourselves being involved more and more in contemporary conflicts for a number of reasons to try and get to more of the core of what's happening and understanding why it's happening, and also making sure that the lessons that we're learning now are not forgotten for the future. So I think personally that's one direction I see the field going. But there can be no doubt about it that the project of battlefield and conflict archaeology has been a success. When I first said to my colleagues 10 years ago that I wanted to go to Zululand and look at the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa of 1879, I was laughed out of court. Someone in fact said, "Tony's been watching too many movies again." And to look at what's happening now in the world of academic archaeology, archaeologists all over the world are queuing up to apply aspects of the processes that have developed over the last 10 years to what we would call conflict archaeology. Archaeologists from all periods, prehistorians, historical archaeologists, it's now an accepted field, but it's literally been a battle to get to where we are today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.